Have you ever stood somewhere so quiet that the silence itself felt wrong? Not peaceful, not calm, wrong. Like the land was holding its breath, like it was waiting for you to make a mistake. I have, more times than I can count. And after everything I have seen out on the high plains, I still have no good explanation for any of it. My name is Marlo Kinsley. I am a search and rescue volunteer with a regional SAR unit based out of a small town called Drennan Flats in southern Alberta. If you have never heard of Drennan Flats, that is not surprising. It sits about 3 hours east of Lethbridge, right where the foothills flatten out and the land opens up into something vast and strange. Most people pass through without stopping. The ones who stop usually do not stay long. I have been with the unit for 11 years. Before that, I spent 4 years working as a wildland firefighter. I know how to read terrain. I know how to stay calm when things go sideways. I know the difference between a bad situation and a dangerous one. I say this not to brag. I say it because what I am about to tell you is going to sound hard to believe. And I need you to understand that I am not someone who gets rattled easily. Our SR unit covers a wide stretch of land. Most of it is open grassland, rolling hills of dry brown grass that go on forever in every direction. But tucked along the northern edge of our zone is something different. It is a region we call the Pale Flats. That is not an official name. You will not find it on any government map. It is just what our team has always called it. The land there is lower than the surrounding terrain. The grass is lighter in color, almost white in certain seasons. And the border that runs along its far edge is not the kind of border you will find on a survey. It is older than that, much older. The elders in the nearby Nakota community do not talk about it much. But the ones who do say that the boundary has been there longer than any living memory. Longer than their grandparents' grandparents could recall. We work alongside the Nakota Liaison Program on some of our operations. It was through that work that I first learned about the rules. But I will get to that. Our team is small. 7 active volunteers, including me. We cover missing persons, lost hikers, injured hunters, the occasional overturned ATV. Out on the high plains, the calls are not as frequent as they are in the mountain zones, but when they do come in, they tend to be complicated. The terrain looks simple from a distance. Flat, open, easy to navigate. But it lies. The draws and coulees are invisible until you are right on top of them. Visibility can drop to nothing in under 10 minutes when the wind picks up. And the distances are deceptive. Something that looks like it is a kilometer away can take 40 minutes to reach on foot. I have pulled people out of that country who were completely disoriented after less than 2 hours. Experienced hunters, former military, people who should have known better. There is something about the Pale Flats specifically that seems to strip away your sense of direction. I noticed it the first time I worked a search out there. The feeling of being watched, combined with a strange certainty that north was somewhere it was not. I mentioned it to one of my senior team members at the time. His name was Gareth. He had been with the unit for close to 20 years. He did not laugh at me. He just nodded slowly and said, "You feel it too. Most people do the first time." That was the first thing that made me pay closer attention. Over the years, I have logged well over 200 field hours in that region. I have done grid searches, hasty searches, trail sweeps, and night operations in the Pale Flats. I have seen things I could not explain. And I have learned slowly and carefully what the rules are and why they exist. By the end of this account, you will know the rules too. All of them, including the one I almost broke. The one that I genuinely believe would have changed the outcome of everything. When I tell you what happened during the winter of my 9th year on the team, I think you will understand why I still think about it. Why do I still wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes and stare at the ceiling? But we need to start at the beginning. because the rules do not make sense without the context, and the context takes time to build. I hope you stay with me, because this is not a ghost story. I am not going to tell you there are monsters hiding in the dark. I am going to tell you something more unsettling than that. I am going to tell you about a place that has its own logic, its own order, and what can happen when someone stumbles into that order without knowing the rules. Stay with me. It starts with a missing boy and a set of boot tracks that should not have been there. The call came in on a Thursday morning in late October. A 14-year-old boy named Cody Paris had gone out with his uncle the day before to check on a small herd of cattle grazing on leased land near the northern edge of our zone. The uncle, a man named Dale, said Cody had wandered off while he was fixing a fence line. Dale figured the boy had gone back to the truck. When he got back to the truck an hour later, Cody was not there. Dale searched on his own for another 2 hours before calling it in. By the time our team was activated and on scene, Cody had been missing for nearly 16 hours. We started with the basics. The last known point was a fence line about 4 kilometers south of the Pale Flats boundary. The weather was cold but dry. Temperatures had dropped to -8 overnight. Cody was wearing a heavy canvas jacket, jeans, and work boots. Not ideal, but not a death sentence either, as long as he had stayed moving and found some shelter. We split into 2 teams. I took the northern sweep with a newer volunteer named Priya, and one of our most experienced trackers, a man named Frank Holloway. Frank had grown up on a ranch not far from Drennan Flats. He had been doing SR work for nearly as long as Gareth had. He was quiet and deliberate, and he did not waste words. We moved north through the grass. The ground was hard. A thin frost clung to the stalks and crunched softly under our boots. The sky was low and gray, and the light had that flat quality it gets in late October, where everything looks slightly drained of color. Even by the standards of the high plains, the land felt empty. We found the first track about 40 minutes in. A boot print pressed into a soft patch of bare earth beside a dry creek bed. The size matched Cody. The tread matched what his uncle had described. We marked it and kept moving, following the line of the creek bed north. Then Frank stopped. He crouched down and looked at something in the grass. I moved up beside him. He was looking at a second set of prints. They were not Cody's. They were much larger, long and narrow with an unusual spacing between steps. I had done enough tracking to recognize that the stride length was off, too long for a normal adult walking at a moderate pace. Not running, just walking, but covering far more ground per step than it should have. I asked Frank what he thought made them. He stood up slowly. He looked north toward the Pale Flats for a long moment before he answered. He said they were probably just tall people. Someone with a long natural stride. He said it in that tone people use when they are telling you the thing that sounds reasonable while thinking about a different thing entirely. I did not push it. We kept moving. We found 2 more of Cody's prints over the next 20 minutes. They were still tracking north. And so were the large prints. They were not side by side with Cody's. They were parallel, running about 15 meters to the east, keeping pace. Something about that made the back of my neck feel cold. Not from the wind. Priya noticed it too. She asked Frank if he thought someone else was out here with the boy. Frank said it was possible. He said it in that same measured way. Careful, like he was choosing his words. We crested a low rise and the Pale Flats opened up ahead of us. I had seen them dozens of times, but they always stopped me for a second. The grass really does look pale, almost bleached, like the color had been pressed out of it. The flatness of it is total. No trees, no rocks, nothing vertical except the sky. It stretches north until it meets a low ridge that marks the edge of our operational zone. Cody's tracks continued north, straight into the Pale Flats. The large prints did not. They stopped at the edge, right at the line where the pale grass began. I walked the boundary for about 30 meters in each direction. The large prints ran right up to that line and then simply ended. No turn, no trail leading away. Just stopped. Frank watched me check the line. When I came back to him, he was looking out into the pale flats with his jaw set tight. I asked him what he thought. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that we should call in the position and wait for the team leader before moving north. I asked him why. We had a missing child. The temperature was dropping. Every minute mattered. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and he said something that I have thought about many times since that day. He said, "Marlo, there are things about this part of the country that the training manual does not cover. I am not going to tell you not to do your job, but before we walk into the pale flats, I need you to know what you are agreeing to, and I cannot explain it standing here in 5 minutes." I stared at him. Priya stared at him. He had already reached for his radio. We found Cody 40 minutes later. He was sitting in a shallow coulee about 200 meters inside the pale flats boundary. He was cold and shaken but physically unharmed. He said he had gotten turned around and walked in circles for what felt like hours. When we asked him if he had seen anyone else out there, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. He said he had seen someone standing far off to the east. Very tall, very still, just watching him. He said he had not moved toward it. He said somehow he just knew not to. I did not write that part in my official report. I did not know why at the time. It just felt like the kind of detail that would raise questions I was not ready to answer. Looking back now, I think some part of me had already started to understand that what was happening out here followed a different kind of logic than the one I had been trained for. That night, after debrief, Frank asked me if I had time for a coffee. I said yes. We drove to a diner on the edge of town and sat in a corner booth. The place was almost empty. Frank wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "You need to hear the rules." Frank did not rush into it. That was the first thing I noticed. He did not lean forward with wide eyes and start telling me a scary story. He spoke the way he did everything. Slowly, carefully, like a man laying down fence posts, one at a time, making sure each one was solid before moving to the next. He started by telling me that he had not come up with the rules himself. He said they had been passed down through the SR unit for as long as anyone could remember. Gareth had told them to him, and before Gareth, an older volunteer named Sutton had told them to Gareth. Frank did not know how far back it went, but he said the rules had not changed. Not once. In all the years he had been on the team. That told him something. He also told me that some of the rules lined up almost exactly with things the Nakota liaison had shared with him years earlier. Not identical, but close enough that Frank believed they were describing the same thing from two different directions. He said that gave him more confidence in them than anything else. I asked him what the rules were actually about. What were we dealing with out there? He said he did not know exactly. He said nobody did. And he said that was part of the point. He told me that trying to understand what was in the pale flats was like trying to read a book written in a language you had never seen. You could look at the shapes on the page all day long, but the meaning was not going to come to you. The only thing you could do was learn how to behave around it. That was what the rules were for. Then he told me the rules. The first rule was this: you do not enter the pale flats alone. Ever. Under any circumstance. He said this was the most important one. He said if you were somehow separated from your team and found yourself at the boundary alone, you waited. You did not cross. It did not matter how urgent the situation felt. You waited for another person. I asked what would happen if someone crossed alone. He said he did not know firsthand, But he said Gareth had told him about a volunteer from the early 90s who had done it. A man named Doris, though Frank could not recall his last name. Doris had crossed alone during a night search. His team had found him the next morning sitting about a kilometer inside the boundary. He was not hurt. He was not hypothermic. But he did not speak for 3 days. And when he finally did speak, he resigned from the unit the same afternoon. He never went back into the field. Frank said that as far as he knew, Doris had never explained what happened. He just said he would not go back. And the way he said it was enough that no one pushed him. The second rule was that you did not follow anything that moved parallel to you along the boundary. I felt something shift in my chest when he said that. I thought about the large prints we had found that afternoon, running 15 meters east of Cody's trail, keeping pace. I did not say anything yet. I just listened. Frank said that whatever moved along the boundary was not lost. It was not in distress. It was not something you were going to help by following it. He said that if you saw movement along the edge and you turned toward it, you were making a choice you could not take back. He did not elaborate on what that choice led to. He said he did not know specifically. He just said you did not follow it. Full stop. The third rule was about sound. He said that if you heard something calling from inside the Pale Flats and it used a name, you did not answer. He said it did not matter if the voice sounded familiar. It did not matter if it sounded like someone on your team, or someone you loved, or even like yourself. If it used a name, you stayed quiet. You used a whistle or an air horn to signal your position if signaling was necessary. You did not use your voice, and you absolutely did not call back. I asked him if that had ever happened, a voice using a name. He nodded once. He said it had happened to him personally, about 6 years before that conversation. He said he had been running a grid sweep on the eastern edge of the Pale Flats with a partner. They had separated briefly to check a draw. He heard what sounded exactly like his partner calling his name from somewhere north of his position. He said the voice was perfect. The cadence, the tone, everything. He had taken 2 steps toward it before something stopped him. He said it was not a thought exactly, more like pressure. Like the air in front of him had gone solid. He stopped. He used his whistle. His partner answered from the south, well behind him. His partner had not called out at all. Frank took a long sip of his coffee after he said that. He looked at the table again. I did not fill the silence. The fourth rule was one that took me a moment to fully absorb. He said that if you found a person inside the Pale Flats and they did not recognize you, you did not argue with them about it. You did not try to convince them of who you were. You stayed calm. You used simple directions. You guided them toward the boundary and out. You did not ask them what they had seen. You did not ask them what had happened to them. You waited until they were out of the Pale Flats entirely before you spoke about anything other than walking. He said this one came from a specific incident. He did not give me all the details that night. But he said a team years back had found a missing woman inside the boundary. She had been there for about 2 days. When they reached her, she looked at the team leader, a woman she had known personally for years, and had no recognition at all. She was calm, not confused exactly, just empty of context. The team leader had made the mistake of trying to orient her, telling her who she was, where she was, what had happened. The woman had become extremely distressed. She had run back north into the Pale Flats. It had taken hours to get her back out. She recovered eventually, Frank said, but it was slower than it should have been. The disorientation lasted much longer than it would have if the team had just walked her out quietly. The fifth rule was the one that Frank seemed most reluctant to say out loud. He set down his mug. He looked at me directly. He said that you did not look for the source of the parallel movement. If you saw the large prints at the boundary, or saw something tall moving at the edge of your vision along the perimeter, you noted it and you kept your eyes forward. You did not investigate. You did not try to get a better look. He said this was not about fear. He said it was about respect. He used that word very deliberately. Respect. He said the thing at the boundary was not threatening you. It was monitoring. It was doing something that it had apparently been doing in that place for a very long time. And the agreement, if you could call it that, was that you did your work and it did its work and you did not interfere with each other. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him what he thought it was. He looked at me for a long time. He said he thought it was old. Older than the town. Older than the maps. He said he thought it had been there since before anyone had drawn a border through that land. And he said that whatever it was, it did not seem hostile as long as the rules were followed. But he said the word hostile very carefully, like he was being precise, like there was a difference between hostile and dangerous that he wanted me to understand without having to spell it out. I understood. I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was cold. I needed the air. My mind kept going back to Cody sitting in that coulee. The way he had gone quiet when we asked about the figure he had seen. The way he said he had known not to move toward it. I thought about the large prints stopping at the boundary line. I thought about whatever had walked beside that boy for 200 meters and then simply let him be. I did not sleep well that night. But it was not fear exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you realize that a place you thought you understood has a whole second layer to it. And you have been walking on the surface of it for years without knowing what was underneath. The rules were in my head now. All 5 of them. And I was about to learn why they existed. The winter that followed was quiet at first. We had 2 calls in November. Both were straightforward. A hunter with a sprained ankle about 12 kilometers south of the Pale Flats boundary, and an elderly man who had wandered from a rural property near Drennan Flats during an early snowfall. We found him in under 2 hours, cold but fine. Neither call took us near the northern zone. I used that quiet time to pay attention in a different way. When we ran training exercises near the boundary, I watched the edge of the Pale Flats instead of looking through it. I started noticing things I had not registered before. Small things. The way the wind behaved differently right at the boundary line. Everywhere else on the high plains the grass moved in long rolling waves when the wind came through. But at the edge of the Pale Flats the grass was often still. Even when the wind was strong. Like something was interrupting it. Redirecting it. I noticed that birds did not fly over the Pale Flats. I had spent hundreds of hours in that country, and had never consciously registered it until Frank put the rules in my head. But once I looked for it, it was obvious. Hawks, ravens, Canada geese moving south for the season. They all tracked around the boundary. Not dramatically. Not in a panicked way. They just curved. Like the airspace above the Pale Flats was a thing they preferred not to enter. I mentioned this to Frank during a training day in early December. He nodded like it was something he had long since accepted. He said the deer did the same thing. He said in all his years working in that country, he had never found deer tracks inside the Pale Flats boundary. Not once. That detail settled into me and stayed there. The pattern I want to tell you about started in January. We had an unusual stretch of mild weather for that time of year. The kind of false thaw that makes people overconfident. 3 separate calls came in within 10 days, all from the northern zone. All within a few kilometers of the Pale Flats boundary. The first was a pair of ice fishermen who had driven their truck out onto what they thought was a frozen slough and gone through the ice. They were fine, cold and embarrassed. But when I was helping one of them to the warm truck, he grabbed my arm and said something that caught my attention. He said that before they went through the ice, he had seen something standing on the far bank watching them. very tall. He had thought at first it was another person, but it had not moved. Not once. For the whole time they were out there. Just stood and watched. He said when he looked back after they went through the ice it was gone. I wrote it down in my personal notes that night. Not my official report. My personal notes. The second call was a solo snowmobiler who had gotten disoriented after a whiteout and ended up stopped about 800 meters south of the boundary. He was fine. I had the sense to stay put and call for help. But he said something similar to the fisherman. He said that during the whiteout, when visibility was near zero, he had heard something moving alongside him. Not behind him. Alongside. Matching his speed. He had slowed down. Whatever it was slowed down. He had stopped. Whatever it was stopped. He had not been able to see it through the snow, but he said he could feel it there. He said it was the most certain he had ever been of something he could not see. The third call was the one that shifted things. A woman named Bex Taylor called in her husband as missing on a Sunday afternoon. Her husband, a man named Paul, had gone out that morning to check on some equipment stored in a Quonset near the northern boundary of their leased land. He had not come back for lunch. He had not come back for supper. Bex said that was not like him at all. We were on scene by 7 in the evening. The light was already gone. The temperature was dropping toward -15. We had headlamps and a clear sky with good moonlight, which helped. We found Paul's truck parked beside the Quonset right where Bex had expected it. The equipment inside looked like he had been working on it. A wrench was sitting out. A panel had been removed from a diesel generator. He had clearly started the job and then left in the middle of it. His tracks led north from the Quonset. Straight north. Like he had just started walking and not stopped. Frank looked at the tracks for a long moment without speaking. I asked him what he saw. He said the stride was normal at first. But about 50 meters from the Quonset the stride length changed. Got longer. Like Paul had started moving faster without the tracks showing a run. Like he had been pulled into a longer pace without meaning to. We followed the tracks north. They led directly to the Pale Flats boundary. And then they continued across it. I felt the cold in a different way when I saw that. Not the cold weather. Something underneath it. Frank radioed our team leader, a man named Buster Crane, and told him what we had found. Buster told us to hold position and wait for the full team before entering. We held. While we waited, I walked the boundary line east and west the way I had done the day we found Cody. I was looking for the parallel prints. I found them after about 40 meters. The same long narrow stride. The same unusual spacing. Running parallel to Paul's tracks about 20 meters to the west. They came from the south, tracked north alongside Paul's trail, and crossed the boundary with him. They had gone in together. Or at least at the same time. I stood there looking at those prints in the moonlight and felt something I did not have a good word for. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling of understanding something you had hoped you were wrong about. Like confirmation arriving when you had been quietly hoping for doubt. The full team arrived 20 minutes later. 7 of us total. We entered the Pale Flats together. The search took 4 hours. The Pale Flats felt different at night. I had been in there after dark before, but not since Frank had given me the rules. Everything I saw now had a second meaning to it. The stillness felt intentional. The way our headlamp beams seemed to flatten out and lose distance in the pale grass. The sound of our footsteps felt absorbed rather than carried. Nobody talked much. Frank had briefed the team on the rules before we entered. Most of them already knew. Priya was the only one hearing them for the first time the way I had heard them months before. I watched her face while Frank spoke. She had that same look I imagined I had worn. The look of someone recalibrating. We found Paul Taylor 2.5 kilometers inside the boundary. He was sitting on the ground facing north. Not curled up. Not collapsed. Just sitting. Like he had stopped to rest and then forgotten to start again. He was conscious. His core temperature was low but not critical. He was lucky the night had not been colder. When I crouched down in front of him and put my light on his face, he looked at me without recognition. I remembered the fourth rule. I did not tell him my name. I did not tell him where he was. I said very calmly that I was here to help him and that I needed him to stand up and walk with me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Like the simplicity of the instruction was enough to reach him when nothing else would have. We walked him south. Nobody asked him questions. Nobody tried to explain anything. We just walked. He crossed the boundary on his own 2 feet, and within about 10 minutes something changed in his face. The blankness started to lift. By the time we reached the Quonset, he knew his own name. By the time Bex arrived and took his hands, he was crying, and I do not think he fully understood why. He told us later that he did not remember leaving the Quonset. He did not remember walking north. He said the last thing he remembered was removing the panel from the generator, and then there was nothing until he was walking south with our team. He said one other thing quietly while Buster was filing the paperwork. He said that while he was sitting out there in the dark before we found him, he had not felt alone. He said something had been nearby. He could not see it, but he said it was the least frightened he had felt during the whole experience. Like whatever was there was not interested in hurting him, just in being close. I wrote that down too. 3 calls in 10 days. 3 separate encounters near or inside the boundary. The pattern was clear enough that Frank and I talked about it on the drive back to town. He said that in his experience the activity near the Pale Flats seemed to increase during certain seasons. He was not sure if it was temperature, light levels, or something else entirely, but January and February tended to be the most active months. He said to pay attention. I told him I already was. What I did not tell him was that I had started having a recurring dream, the same one several nights a week. I was standing at the boundary of the Pale Flats in the dark. The pale grass was ahead of me, and somewhere out in that flatness something was standing still and looking back. In the dream I always knew it could see me much better than I could see it. And in the dream I always had the feeling that it had been watching me specifically for a very long time. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical work but from sustained alertness. I know what it feels like to be tired after a long search. Boots soaked through, shoulders aching from the pack, eyes strained from scanning terrain for hours. That kind of tiredness is clean. You come home, you eat something, you sleep, and in the morning your body has done most of the repair work on its own. I started feeling that January was different. It was the tiredness that comes from never fully switching off. From carrying a question you cannot put down. From knowing that something exists just north of your daily life that does not follow the rules you were raised to believe in. I did not talk about it with anyone outside the unit. How would I have? I had friends in Drennan Flats who I had known for years. Good people. Normal people. People who talked about hockey scores and the price of fuel, and whether the co-op was going to stay open or close down. I could not sit across from any of them and say what I was actually thinking about. The gap between my interior life and my regular life had gotten wide very quickly. Even within the unit, it was not something we discussed openly. The rules existed. Everyone who had been on the team long enough knew them. But there was an unspoken agreement that you did not dwell on it. You did not speculate out loud. You did not compare notes in a way that might tip someone from careful alertness into something less functional. Frank had told me the rules because it was necessary, because I was working the northern zone regularly and I needed to know. But he had not told me at the start of an ongoing conversation. He had told me the way you tell someone the emergency procedure for a piece of equipment. Here is what you do. Here is what you do not do. Now you know. I respected that. But it did not stop my mind from working on its own time. I started keeping a more detailed personal journal. Not the kind of dramatic record-keeping that makes everything feel like a story. Just notes. Dates, observations, small details that seemed worth holding on to. The journal became a way of managing what I was carrying. If I wrote something down, I felt slightly less like I had to keep holding it in my head. I wrote about the birds not flying over the Pale Flats. I wrote about the deer tracks that never crossed the boundary. I wrote about the way the wind behaved at the edge. I wrote about the 3 January calls and the parallel prints and Paul Taylor sitting in the dark feeling unafraid. Writing it all down in sequence made something visible that I had not fully seen while I was living it one piece at a time. The thing in the Pale Flats, whatever it was not random. It was not chaotic. It had a consistency to it. The parallel movement along the boundary. The fact that it had walked alongside Cody for 200 meters and then simply stopped. The fact that Paul had been kept company in the cold rather than harmed. There was a logic to it. A pattern of behavior that suggested not malice but something else. Something harder to name. I thought about what Frank had said. The word he had used. Respect. He had said the agreement was that you did your work and it did its work. I kept coming back to that framing. An agreement. It implied 2 parties. It implied that at some point, however far back, someone had understood enough about what was in the Pale Flats to establish terms. And whatever those terms were, they had held. That thought was both steadying and deeply unsettling, because it meant this was not new. People had known about this for a very long time, and they had chosen not to explain it. Not to investigate it, not to name it publicly. They had chosen to manage it, to pass down the rules and trust that the rules would be enough. I found myself wondering what it had cost to learn those rules in the first place. The isolation crept up on me in small ways during those weeks. I started declining invitations I would normally have accepted. Dinners, a birthday gathering at the Legion, a weekend trip a friend had organized to Lethbridge. I told myself I was tired, which was true. But it was also true that I did not want to sit in a warm, bright room full of people who had no idea what I was thinking about. The contrast felt too large. The distance between that world and the one I was navigating felt unbridgeable, in a way that made social situations feel effortful rather than restorative. I spent a lot of evenings at home with my dog, a big mixed breed named Gus, sitting by the wood stove and reading or just staring at the fire. Gus would put his head in my lap and I would scratch his ears, and sometimes I would feel almost normal. He was in good company during that time, uncomplicated in the best possible way. One evening in late January, I drove out to the boundary on my own. Not for a call, just to look. I know that sounds strange. Maybe it was. But I had been carrying the Pale Flats in my head for weeks, and I wanted to stand at the edge of it and just be present with it rather than thinking about it from a distance. I parked my truck on the frozen 2-track that ran along the southern edge of our zone and walked north until I reached the boundary. It was around 9 in the evening. Clear sky. Brilliant cold stars. The moonlight was strong enough to see me without a headlamp. The pale grass was silver in that light. The flatness of the Pale Flat stretched north in silence. I stood at the boundary for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. The cold was real and steady. My breath came out in small clouds. Gus had come with me and he stood at my side with his ears up and his body very still. He was not growling. He was not frightened. He was just alert in a focused, serious way that I had never seen from him before or since. I did not cross the boundary. I had not intended to. I was just there to look. After about 15 minutes, I became aware of something in my peripheral vision. Far to the east along the boundary line, a shape, tall, still, standing in the pale grass on the other side of the line, just at the edge of what the moonlight could show me. I did not turn my head to look directly at it. I remembered the fifth rule. You kept your eyes forward. You did not try to get a better look. I kept my eyes on the space straight ahead of me. My heart was beating hard. Not from panic, from a kind of full-body awareness. Like every cell in me had gone quiet and attentive at the same time. Gus made a sound I had never heard from him. Not a growl, not a whimper. Something between the two. A low sound deep in his chest that I felt more than heard. Then he pressed himself against my leg and stayed there. I stood at the boundary for another few minutes. The shape in my peripheral vision did not move. It did not come closer. It did not retreat. It simply stood. I said nothing. I used no name. I did not react. Eventually I turned around and walked back to the truck. I did not run. I did not look back. On the drive home my hands were steady on the wheel. But my mind was doing something I can only describe as reorganizing itself. Like a library after an earthquake, where all the books are still there but nothing is in the right place anymore, and you have to figure out a new order for everything. I had known the rules for months. I had believed them in the abstract way you believe things you have been told by someone you trust. But standing at that boundary in the moonlight with Gus pressed against my leg, and that shape at the edge of my vision, I had moved from believing to knowing. Those are not the same thing. There is a version of this story where I tell you that standing at the boundary that night made me feel brave, resolved, like I had faced something and come through it unchanged. That would not be true. What I felt on the drive home was small, not in a defeated way, in a recalibrated way, like I had been reminded of my actual size relative to something much older and much larger than me. And I think that feeling, that specific smallness, was actually the most honest response I could have had. Stayed with me for weeks. It is still with me now, if I am being truthful. The dreams continued. Same image. Standing at the boundary in the dark. Something watching from the pale grass. But after that night a detail changed in the dream. Something I had not noticed before. In the dream, after that night at the boundary, I could see the shape clearly for the first time. And it was looking at me the way you look at someone you recognize. February came in hard. The mild stretch was gone. A high-pressure system settled over southern Alberta and locked the temperature down at -25 for nearly 2 weeks. The kind of cold that makes the air feel brittle. The kind that hurts your face inside of 30 seconds if you are not covered. The kind that kills people who are not prepared for it. We had 2 calls in the first week of February. Neither was near the Pale Flats. One was a snowmobiler who had gone through a creek crossing and soaked himself through. We got to him fast and he was fine. The other was a farm worker who had gotten his clothing caught in a piece of equipment and could not get free. That one was not a search. It was a rescue and it was straightforward. Then on a Thursday night in the second week of February, the call came in that changed things for me permanently. A woman named Soraya felt called in her sister as missing. Her sister's name was Danny. Danny was 26 years old and had driven out to photograph the night sky near the northern zone. She was an amateur astrophotographer, and the cold, clear nights had apparently been ideal for what she was after. She had texted Soraya at around 8 in the evening to say she had found a good spot and was setting up her equipment. After that, nothing. Soraya had tried calling for 2 hours before contacting us. We were activated at 11 at night. -23 degrees with a light wind from the northwest that pushed the wind chill down further. The window for a person in that temperature without shelter was not generous. We moved fast. Danny's car was parked on a gravel pull-off about 1.5 kilometers south of the Pale Flats boundary. Her camera bag was in the back seat. Her tripod was set up about 30 meters from the car, pointing north. The camera was still mounted on it. Whatever she had been planning to photograph, she had abandoned the setup mid-preparation. Her tracks led north from the tripod. Frank did not need to say anything. We both knew where they were going. We radioed Buster and told him what we had found. He told us to move north and not wait for the full team. The temperature made it non-negotiable. Every minute counted. There were 4 of us on the initial sweep. Me, Frank, Priya, and a newer volunteer named Hendrix who had joined the unit in the fall. Hendrix was a good volunteer, calm and capable, but he did not know the rules yet. Frank had not briefed him fully. There had not been a cause before that night. We moved north fast. The cold was serious. Our breath frosted our scarves and the ice formed on the fabric within minutes. The moonlight was strong again, which helped. The Pale Flats boundary appeared ahead of us and Danny's tracks went straight across it without hesitation, like she had not even noticed the transition. Frank briefed Hendrix on the boundary in under 2 minutes while I checked the perimeter for parallel prints. I found them immediately. Same pattern, same stride, running parallel to Danny's tracks about 15 meters to the west. They had crossed into the Pale Flats alongside her. We all crossed the boundary together. All 4 of us. I noted the moment I stepped over the line the way I always did by then. A habit. A small private acknowledgement. We moved north in a tight spread, close enough to keep each other in sight. The Pale Flats were as still as I had ever felt them. The cold seemed to sit differently there than it did on the open plains south of the boundary. Not colder exactly, more present. Like the temperature was something with weight and intention rather than just a condition of the air. We had been inside the boundary for about 20 minutes when Priya grabbed my arm. She pointed east. About 40 meters away, moving parallel to our line of travel, was a shape. Tall, moving at our pace. In the moonlight I could see it clearly enough to register that it was upright and that its stride was long and unhurried. It was not rushing. It was not approaching. It was simply moving alongside us the way the prints always suggested it had been moving alongside others. I felt something drop through me. Not fear. Certainty. The thing I had only ever seen at the edge of my vision before was right there. 40 meters away. In the open. Hendrix saw it at the same moment. He stopped walking. I heard him say something under his breath. Then he took a step toward it. I caught his arm before he took a second step. I held it hard. I did not grab him violently, but I held him the way you hold someone at the edge of something they cannot see clearly. Firm and deliberate. He looked at me. His eyes were wide. Not with fear exactly. With the same compelled curiosity that I imagine pulls people toward things they should walk away from. The shape was tall and strange and real, and everything in his training told him that a person in distress deserved investigation. I leaned close to his ear and I said, as quietly and as clearly as I could, that it was not a person in distress. I said it was not something we were going to follow. I told him to keep his eyes forward and keep walking south on our line. He hesitated. I could feel the resistance in his arm. He was not being reckless. He genuinely thought he was seeing a person who needed help. That instinct is exactly what you want in a SAR volunteer. In any other situation it would have been exactly right. But not here. I said his name once. Quietly. I said, "Trust me right now. We will talk about all of it when we are out of here. But right now you need to keep walking forward." Something in my tone reached him. He exhaled slowly. He turned his eyes forward. The shape continued to move parallel to us for another minute or so. Then I became aware that it had stopped. I did not turn to look. But I could feel the change the way you feel a sound stop in a room and suddenly register the silence. It had simply ceased its lateral movement and was standing still somewhere to our east. We found Danny 11 minutes later. She was lying in the grass, not collapsed in a way that suggested injury, more like she had sat down and then eased herself back. She was conscious but barely responsive. Her core temperature when we got a reading was dangerous. We had caught her in time, but the margin was not comfortable. She did not respond to her name. I remembered the fourth rule without having to think about it. I crouched down and spoke in simple directions. I told her I needed her to sit up. I told her I needed her to stand. I told her to walk with me and keep walking. She responded to the instructions, slowly and mechanically, but she responded. Frank and Hendricks flanked her and we moved south fast. I set the pace. Nobody talked except to give her direction. Walk. This way. Keep going. Good. Keep going. She crossed the boundary on her own feet. The change was not instant, but it was real. Within 2 or 3 minutes of crossing south, she started to come back. Her eyes focused. She said something quiet that I could not hear. Then she said her sister's name. Then she started shaking, which was actually a good sign. Her body was fighting back. We got her wrapped and into warmth as fast as we could. The paramedics took over from there. She recovered fully. She was in hospital for 2 days with mild hypothermia and released without lasting effects. She remembered driving out and setting up her tripod. She remembered looking north through the viewfinder of her camera and seeing something in the distance that she had wanted to photograph. She had started walking toward it to get a better angle. She said that the whole time she was walking north, she had felt completely calm. Not cold. Not tired. Calm. She said it was like being in a dream where the normal rules of discomfort did not apply. She said she had not been frightened at all. She said she had not been able to see clearly what she had walked toward. Just a shape. Far off. Always the same distance ahead of her no matter how far she walked. I did not tell her what I knew. That was not my place. She was safe and she was whole, and the details of why she had walked north in the dark at -23 degrees were not something she needed from me at that moment or possibly ever. Hendricks was quiet on the drive back to town. When we pulled into the unit garage, he sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. Then he asked me how long the rules had been in place. I told him as long as anyone on the team could remember. He asked me if I knew what it was. I told him the same thing Frank had told me, that nobody knew exactly, that it was old, that the agreement was to do your work and let it do its work. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had just had the floor shift slightly under his feet and was deciding how to stand on the new angle of it. I understood that feeling completely. What I did not tell Hendricks that night was what had happened in those seconds when he had started to step toward the shape in the dark. Because in those seconds, while I was holding his arm and feeling his resistance, I had also felt something pulling at me. Not physically, not like a hand on my shoulder, something more internal than that. A pressure at the edge of my attention, like something calling at a frequency just below what you can consciously hear. I had felt it and I had recognized it, and I had held on to Hendricks and kept my feet where they were. But it had been closer than I had ever admitted to anyone. I drove home that night and sat by the wood stove with Gus in my lap, even though he was too big for that. I held on to him and I stared at the fire for a long time. The rules had held. We had all come home. But I knew, in the way you know the things that actually matter, that what I had felt in those seconds of resistance was not a small thing. It was the thing the rules existed to protect against. Not just the physical danger of a person walking north in the cold, but the pull, the compulsion, the way the pale flats reached into you if you let your guard down for even a moment and offered you something that felt, just for a second, like it might be worth walking toward. I lay awake for a long time that night. I thought about Danny walking calmly toward a shape that stayed always the same distance ahead of her no matter how far she walked. I thought about how peaceful she had said it felt. And I thought about how easily, under different circumstances, that could have been me. I have thought about the Pale Flats every single day since that February night. Not with dread. With a kind of quiet respect that has settled into me the way scar tissue settles. Permanent. Changed. Part of the structure now. I still work in the northern zone. I still cross the boundary when a search requires it. I follow the rules every time without exception. And every time I step across that line, I feel the same thing I felt the very first time Frank told me what lay on the other side of my understanding. That the world is larger and older and stranger than the version most people are living inside of. I do not know what the Pale Flats are. I do not know what moves along the boundary. I have stopped needing to know. What I know is that it has been there longer than the town, longer than the maps, longer than any name anyone has given it. And in all that time the agreement has held. As long as the rules are followed, people come home. That has to be enough. It is late March now. The cold has loosened its grip and the high plains are moving towards something that almost resembles color again. I drove out to the boundary last week. Just to stand there. Just to be present with it the way I have learned to be. Gus came with me. He stood at my side with his ears up and his body still and his attention fixed on something north of the line that I could not see. The pale grass was quiet. The sky was enormous. And somewhere out in that flat silver distance, something old and patient was doing whatever it has always done. I stood at the boundary for a long time. Then I turned around and drove home. 3 weeks ago, a new volunteer joined our unit. Young, sharp, eager in the way that good people are eager before work teaches them patience. Buster has assigned her to the Northern Zone rotations starting next month. I have already told Frank that I will handle her briefing personally. There are things about this part of the country that the training manual does not cover. She needs to hear the rules.